Okay, so just a reminder for muting if you're not speaking at the moment. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Marsden from the University of Leeds. I'm on the Zemo board. It gives me great pleasure to chair this afternoon's discussion on the sharing agenda and other options, and not just pleased to chair it, but pleased to see it as part of the decarbonisation plan. But sharing comes in many different forms, and we've got some great speakers this afternoon. They're going to do maximum 5 minutes each, and then we're going to throw the floor open to discussion. So please use the chat function, start posting your questions on the way through, and I'll do my best to kind of field as many of them as I can. Anyway, you came to listen to them rather than listen to me. So I'm going to hand over to the first of our great speakers, Ali Clabburn, who's the Chief Executive of Mobilityways. You might have seen him earlier on today, part of the LiftShare group. He's been in this business for a long time, and I guess thoroughly delighted to see it start to being talked about in policy papers more seriously. So over to you, Ali, for your first address.
Thanks, Greg, and huge thanks to you personally for all your support you've given the sector the last few years. Yeah, I don't want to repeat too much of what I said this morning, so I'm going to keep my bit really brief. I mean, effectively, when you look at the fleet of cars we need out there, the average car is used like 5–10% of the time. It sits parked the rest of the time. The average car, when it is used, only has one person in it. So the average car is actually only 5% efficient, which means even at peak hours, we only need 10 to 15% of the cars we've actually got out there on the road if they're being used much better. And as much as I was wholly supportive of the TDP and absolutely delighted by some of its contents, I think it's really important that we realize that we can't just keep consuming things the way we have done. We need to change behaviors. We need to consume less. We have one planet, we have limited resources, and the idea of continually building as many cars as we've got now or as many buses or whatever is simply ridiculous. We can do a whole load on occupancy. The average occupancy, if we increase it to 1.7, will save 3 million tons of CO2. That's the equivalent of electrifying every single bus we've got in this country. And that's just going from 1.6 to 1.7. If we can get up to 2, we'll save another whole load of CO2. So I totally welcome the report. I really welcome the focus on occupancy and the need for local authorities and businesses to start looking at their car occupancy. And I also really, really welcome the focus. It slips in right at the back of the TDP, but it's on the role of employers. I think employers have an absolutely essential role to play in this. Some of the trailblazers are already really making a great go at it. They're reporting their Scope 3 emissions, not because they have to, but because they want to, and they realize how important it is. And it's been amazing seeing some of the huge corporates get on board with that. So I'm thrilled to see the TDP. There's a lot of work to be done. It's a shame it doesn't set a goal for car occupancy. It just says we're going to increase it by 2030. That's not particularly ambitious. We need to not only increase it, but increase it significantly, probably by 10, 20, 30% by 2030 if we're to stand any chance of getting to net zero. And at that, I really want to get onto the questions at the end, so I'm going to stop there.
Great, thanks for that, Ali. Some really interesting points to pick up on. What are the tools and interventions that are actually going to help us to deliver on sharing when we come back to Q&A. So just a reminder to everyone, you can post your questions in the chat function and we'll pick them up after the first 4 talks. So going to hand over now to a different part of the sharing space. So it's Joel Teague, who's the founder of Co-Charger. It's going to be an awful lot of charge points around the UK shortly, but this is a really interesting, different way of thinking about how many we need and how we're going to use them. So over to you, Joel.
Thanks very much. Yes, so just to set the scope of my particular shameless 5-minute soapbox, within the wider context, this is all about if you really have to run a car, then make it a zero emissions one, and the fact that you're 4 times more likely to have an electric car if you've got somewhere to charge it at home, and that leaves about 15 million people very, very disadvantaged and probably sticking with what they've got. Within that, I'm very keen on keeping the focus on what really matters, which is stop burning stuff. The aim isn't to get people into EVs, it's to stop burning fossil fuels. And to do that, one part is we have to get people out of ICE vehicles. And to do that, we have to understand what gets people out of those vehicles. And I'll be honest, I don't think we do. At least we behave as if we don't. And while there are a lot of really good things in the decarbonisation plan, it makes one huge incorrect assumption that public charges get people out of fossil fuel cars. On their own, they don't. We know that. It gets people who can charge at home out of fossil fuel cars, and it's very convenient for them and it's essential. But on its own, for the 15 million or so motorists who can't charge at home, it's still a blocker. And we know that, you know, from the research by people like Connected Curb and your own common sense, our own research, people need 3 things before they will make that leap. If we get inside the head of the average motorist who isn't one of us, they're not sort of informed and passionate about this. They are misinformed, scared, resistant. They need 3 things before they make that huge leap. We just heard it on some of the sort of video clips. They want it to be totally dependable charging. They need it to be convenient, basically while I'm at home or while I'm at work. They want it to be affordable. Otherwise, they're just going to run a 10-year-old diesel in 2040, and we can't have that. So there is a big obsession, especially in the report, with route and destination charging, with new hardware, with infrastructure. And why is that? I don't know. Maybe it's that mere exposure effect, that they're obsessing with the thing that looks most familiar. Here's how you fuel a car, therefore here's how you charge a car. There's a big problem with people not realizing that, no, you can't equate those two. It's more like a mobile phone. It's a very different thing. And also, I don't think we yet understand the mental journey that someone goes through from, oh, I don't like the sound of this, through to, I love my EV. So we need to do more work on that. And part of that, we need to switch to a model for charging and a language based on the motorist's need. We came up with something that's now going out for discussion called the BRD model, the base route destination model. Very much it does what it says on the tin. So destination, we know about, it's only about 7% of charging. While I'm there, I'll plug in. Route gets a lot of the headlines. It's while I'm on the way there, but it's only 3%, a vital 3%, but only 3%. Base is very different. Base charging is the way somebody decides to own an EV. It's how am I going to charge this thing day to day? So it's either at home, it's at work, or my bit, community charging, or it's mobile charging, or it's curbside charging. It's 90% of charging, and yet it's almost none of the discussion. So my view is we need to be talking base first, because without base, the other 2 don't have any customers. So community charging, for those who don't know, co-charger is one version of it. Yes, we coined the phrase, very proud of that, but we're just one version of it. The platform is one that enables someone with a charger or a company with a workplace charger to make it available to a handful of neighbors on a regular basis so that they can switch to an EV. And just to differentiate, there are also charge point sharing destination apps, like there's really good ones like Book My Charge and Zap Home and Plug Share. Very different, just using the same tool. So community charging, what we do, is not a panacea. There isn't one. Very much part of a patchwork. But the problem, the sort of elephant in the room for me is we're getting very excited over tens of thousands of public chargers. There are around 400,000 home and workplace chargers right now. And much like we just said about the cars, there's utilization is about 5 hours a week on each one. It's pathetic. It's even lower in the car. And we're not making use of that. So in terms of what do, we have that infrastructure. It's growing by about 500 charge points a day. We just have to use it better. So what can we all do? Well, we can share and we need to communicate. If just 1 in 25 of those charges is shared, that's enough to make up that huge shortfall between even the most ambitious public charge point building program and the demand that we know we're going to need to meet. Because there is a gap. No one likes to talk about it, but it's huge. But just 1 in 25 charges, 4%, will plug that gap. Excuse the pun. So who can do what? Central government, make it part of the conversation. You know, it shouldn't just be a breakout thing, no offense, but this should be front and center as well. It's a glaring omission from the plan, in my view. Promote it in the same way government did for recycling, and now that's part of our lives. It's a free hit, you know, right to all the people who've had a grant for a charger. Do it now. There's no downside. It's free. Just do it. Local government, same thing. Make it part of your plan. Fight the urge to obsess with route and destination charging. Put base charging at the core of your plans, and use sharing because it's free. Car companies, is already happening. Nobody should leave a car showroom with a new ICE vehicle because they couldn't charge it at home. You know, no driveway, no problem should be the theme. Every car sales exec needs to have this in their toolbox. And when it comes to individuals and small companies with car parks, very simple. What can we do today? If you have a charger, or if you're going to get one, accept some responsibility for making the difference, share that charger, sign up for these apps, all of them. They're complementary, they don't overlap. We can't expect a miracle, it's down to us. So share the infrastructure we've got, 400,000 of them, make use of them right now, is what I'm saying. And that was
Great.
5 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Joel. Excellent. Plenty to go at there in discussion as well. We're going to move on to the third aspect of sharing here. We've got Jess Oppetit from VIA. She's the UK country manager. And there's a lot in the plan in various different places about demand responsive transport, which VIA has been a pioneer of. So really looking forward to your thoughts on this, Jess.
Awesome. I'm sadly getting very poor video quality. I hope everyone can hear me okay at least. Yeah, we're all good. Excellent. So I guess I work for VIA. I'm hoping that by now most of you have heard of us. For those that have not, we are part of the revolution on public transport. So I think a huge a part of the national bus strategy and quite a bit of the decarbonisation plan, a little less than I would have liked, but you know, something is better than nothing. Talked a lot about, yes, okay, theoretically, electrification super important, increasing charging super important, but if we're going to kill both congestion and improve utilisation of vehicles, then we're going to have to make the bus better. And I think the National Bus Strategy talked a lot about this. How do we increase the frequency of buses? How do we make buses more user-friendly? And I think demand responsive for us is playing a huge role there. And when I talk about demand responsive and why it's important, I think, you know, we've got to look at kind of, if someone has a private car at home, the only way they're going to take the bus is if it's as convenient and as user-friendly, and actually probably more so. And so how do we get to a point where just, you know, the inconvenience of parking, the inconvenience of congestion gets to a point where people are actually like, I want to take the bus. It's a better use of my time and a better experience. And we've been running demand responsive services globally and across the UK now for some time. Just to give you a bit of context on scale, we're running about 500 services globally in about 35 countries. And in the UK now, we have about 22 deployments, including 2 we launched yesterday, one in Worcestershire and another one in Wales, where we now have quite a number of deployments. And you know, I'm going to talk about why DRT is so important in this move to like net zero. But I would like to shout out that we've got about 20 services globally and growing that are fully or partially electric, most of which are in Europe. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about Milton Keynes, which is one of our largest electric deployments and fortunately sits in the UK. So just in terms of why demand responsive helps in the move to carbon or to net zero, I think, you know, there are probably 3 key things. I think the first is modal shift. If you're going to be able to get people out of private vehicles, you need to, I guess, as I said, make the bus better. And, you know, we are providing a much more efficient service, usually services that are, you know, don't require you to transition buses or to get off one bus and get on another bus to get to your final destination. It's one fluid journey. There are journeys where we aggregate, but we aggregate in a way that makes sense. So we don't make you do empty vehicle mileage to hit bus stops that don't have people waiting. And overall, we've found that as a result, our user satisfaction is much, much higher than typical user satisfaction on the bus. And also we have huge amounts of data. So we're able to survey passengers at the end of each trip. And we typically ask 2 questions. One is, how would have you made this journey otherwise? And the other is, okay, now that you've taken this journey and you know that this service exists, how much are you less likely to use your car or to think about a second car? And we've seen really, really positive movements in the modal shift space, which makes us fairly confident that these are services that are really going to make the bus cool again. I think the second is we also just reduce inefficiency with routing. So if you think about the average bus and you think about the average bus during COVID, you know, the bus service operators grant, they effectively, the government incentivized bus companies to run the same amount of mileage despite humongous reductions in passengers. Like, to me, that was just a crazy incentivization scheme. The opposite happened in all our services. So in the Tees Valley, in Kent, in Wales, in Northeast Links, like we ran services and we said, okay, actually, you know, there's a huge reduction in demand. Let's take all of these vehicles off the road and let's just run the most optimal fleet. Okay, now instead of doing random stops and making our essential workers cover half of the area where no one is at, there's no demand. Let's just make the buses go where there's demand, from the hospitals to and from where these people live. Let's do it in a much more fluid and efficient way. You know, if there are passenger caps, if today they're 10, tomorrow they're 20, then 30, like we can do that instantaneously. And so as a result, we saw huge cost savings and much fewer vehicle miles traveled. And again, just, you know, if you're reducing vehicle mileage and maximizing the number of trips being taken, again, you're just seeing a huge path to net zero. And then finally, like, we're really pushing towards electrification where we can. We're encouraging, like, you know, if we're going to run these services, we should be doing them in electric vehicles. And that again has added complications. How do you take into account charging and the level of charge in the way that you allocate passengers and vehicles, passengers to vehicles? And I think we're at the forefront there again, technologically. And my last, like, very quick plug before I hand it back is, you know, Milton Keynes probably one of our best examples of a local authority that this year did something pretty drastic. They took 100% of their subsidised network and decided to make it demand responsive. And not only that, they decided to actually push for electric. And this was a service, you know, a subsidised network that was running once an hour, non-electric vehicles, costing the government, you know, upwards of £12 per ride, particularly getting worse through COVID. And without being able to meaningfully reduce ETAs, make 50% of the vehicles electric, huge improvement in quality of service. And as a result, the bounce back post-COVID has been much, much higher on MK Connect than it has been in the equivalent subsidised or non-subsidised bus network in Milton Keynes, which I think helps to prove all of these individual points. And again, the modal shift surveys we've been running there have been telling us that people are less likely to buy a second vehicle and using their private vehicles a lot less as a result of this service. So yeah, again, similar to Ali, very happy that we heard mention of sharing throughout the decarbonisation plan, but I would have liked to have seen a lot more with regards to kind of how the government's targets, how the government was allocating funding towards this. But again, excited to see this conversation move forward.
Great, thanks for that, Jess. We've got some questions already coming through in the chat on that. So final of our 4 speakers, James Lancaster, who's the Head of Mobility Innovation, Local Policy and Partnerships in Europe. We'll be talking about the role of enterprise and I think car rental and car sharers, car clubs as well, so as part of the mix. So over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Greg, and I seem to have the longest job title in the world. I think for enterprise, you know, it's about how we use the car, not banning the use of the car, and it links to some of what Ali was saying, where you can drive efficiencies in changing the way that people travel. For our business, we've got more than 100,000 vehicles, shared vehicles, within 10 miles of 94% of UK households. So I think car rental in particular can play a key role in shifting people away from ownership to usership. And I think an interesting thing for us is, you know, the utilisation of a private vehicle is very low, whereas we derive revenue from increased utilisation. So we want as many people using our vehicles as regularly as possible, different users. So people that move away from ownership, but as and when they need a certain vehicle for a particular trip, they can access one of our assets. And, you know, to sort of justify that point, we've spent the last 4 years building up partnerships with Brompton Bike Hire, Next Bike, Stagecoach, the bus company, to develop joint propositions to take to, in particular, local authorities to deploy those types of solutions. I think also on average, our vehicles are 8 to 12 months old, a lot cheaper, cleaner than the private car park, which is 7 to 9 years old typically. And as I say, I think a drop in ownership and a shift to usership will grow the entire sustainable transport sector. And that's evidenced by this year's Car Club survey that suggested for every one of our vehicles that's introduced, it takes 12 private cars off the road. And then sort of building on where the government went with their decarbonisation plan, we were delighted to be one of the case studies there, where they talked about the work we do with Highland Council in Scotland, where we went in and provided enterprise car club vehicles, but also access to our daily rental fleet. And they moved away from mileage reimbursement, which is frankly one of the craziest policies to still have in place, where you're reimbursing somebody 45 pence per mile to drive. And when we talk about the behaviour of businesses, that's public and private sector, there's little changes that can be made that can have a huge impact. For example, in the Highlands of Scotland, it's resulted in moving away from mileage reimbursement. Has seen a 37% reduction in carbon emissions since 2018, and an overall drop of 28% in business mileage, because people are using rental services when they need to, but also public and active travel. They're not just driving their car to work and then getting paid to do all of the trips they have to do throughout the day. And I think just on the decarb plan, obviously we've been deploying a number of projects almost in silos. So we've got a mass program we ran in Manchester with our partners. We've got one that's just gone live in the Highlands of Scotland, huge rural project that's brought together the entire supply chain and going to cover a geographical area the size of Belgium, which we're really excited about. And I'll put in the chat function a link to that project, because that's not a pilot, that's a 3-year project, which is really, really exciting. And some people might think we're mad. We've done it in the most rural part of the UK. But obviously, based on the success of working with the Highland Council, we feel like it's something we can roll out to residents as an integrated transport solution. But for me, the biggest issues that hold things up, taxation. You know, we can't, in partnership, launch our van sharing business in the UK because benefit in kind is prohibitive for all those users. DFP can have the best ambitions in the world, but if you know, a company like us can't launch a product in the UK because of a tax system that isn't fit for purpose and an archaic BIC regime, that creates issues for us. And then I'll touch on it again, but Greyfleet, we need to talk about it more. There were a few references to that, but I think businesses have a responsibility. You have local authorities as well in the public sector that are introducing things like clean air zones, but then still rewarding their staff for driving 7 to 9 year old high polluting vehicles for business trips. And those people then choose to drive them to work. And then integration of shared mobility into planning is going to be key. Residential and commercial development, bringing sustainable solutions there, especially as people's behavior is going to change in terms of, will they work from home 3 days a week? If they've got that mobility hub at the development. And we've deployed 2 mobility hubs in the last 12 months, one in Greenwich with BP Chargemaster, and then one at Imperial College for staff, which we launched both during COVID. But we want to see those coming into the planning system as well. I think on the decarbonisation point, a fascinating part of this will be the toolkit for local authorities to help launch businesses like Jess's and Ali's. So that it'll be interesting to see how they're developed and whether there's collaboration with the industry as they do it. So I think that's going to be really important. And we are, as the Urban Mobility Partnership, developing our own toolkit of policies to help grow the sustainable mobility sector and hopefully to help inform government what mobility providers will need. But I think it's very, very welcome. I think it's a big step forward. Hopefully it means it won't just be projects in isolation for us. There'll be a rapid growth in the sector and the deployment of a lot of the services we've been doing almost piecemeal up until now. And it does give an opportunity for radical rethink of transport across the board. But it's not just about local authorities. The private sector needs to join in this as well. So yeah, that's my piece. I'll get to the questions really. But yeah, good decarb plan. Need to look more at tax. Crazy that Greyfleet's still going on, particularly in the public sector. There's no excuse for it anymore. And we need to look holistically at planning as well and how that can change.
Great, thanks a lot, James. Thanks everyone. So we've got about 30 minutes now for questions. We've got quite a few already coming into the chat, so do keep posting them. So I'm going to fire them at 1 or 2 people. If anyone else from the panel wants to come in, just give me a wave. So the first one from Lucy. Seems to be so much talk about electric vehicles, nothing with regards to reducing the emissions and getting better miles per gallon from internal combustion engine vehicles. She points to much better servicing, which the manufacturers put people off from doing. But I guess, Ali, maybe you've got a view on getting much better miles per gallon from ICEs?
Yes, yeah, get 2 people in every one, or 3 or 4 or 5. I mean, it's a great question because you can make serious savings just by emptying out your boot or having your car serviced or using the right fuel. But to be honest, you can double the efficiency by getting 2 people in it rather than 1, or triple it with 3 people, or quadruple it with 4 people. A Range Rover with 4 people in it is more efficient than a typical hybrid. It's crazy that we don't look at occupancy more, and I'm just so thrilled that there is now at least a line in this plan that says occupancy needs to increase, and there's a role in it for local authorities to start measuring their occupancy. I'm only aware of 1 local authority that's actually measured occupancy in the country, and the guidance out from DEFRA uses data from 2003 and assumes occupancy in cars and buses hasn't shifted since then. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space.
Yeah, great. Does anyone else want to come in on that one?
I would just reinforce Ali's point that also, you know, just gave the Scottish Highlands example where they cut CO2 emissions by 38% and none of those vehicles are electric. I mean, they will be over time, but there wasn't the necessary infrastructure for us to be able to do that there at this moment in time. But that is a real, just by change of the way we use the car.
Okay, great. The next question's from Emma Fansett, which is on the role of employers. It's pointed at Ali, but I think probably everyone's got something to say about this one. Where do you think the limit is to what employers should do to support their employees to shift to more planet-friendly transport options above and beyond just providing options? How far should they encourage wider behaviour change? What's their role? Maybe we'll start with perhaps Jess, and then James, Ali, and Joel.
I think that employers, I think everyone needs to play a role, and I think employers are one of them. I think Ali will talk about, I suspect the pertinence there of the commute. I think from a VIA perspective, one of the things we've seen fairly effectively, and we've seen it a lot in Germany, a little bit less in the UK, is actually employers setting up employee shuttles to run very, very high demand network, or sort of high occupancy network, first mile, last mile, particularly to train stations. So if you think about trying to encourage people to take trains to work, the last mile is often what catches people out. And so running these high efficiency shuttles, you know, we've seen in parts of Germany, occupancy up to 15, 20 people per vehicle for that last mile, which is just significantly more efficient than any car is ever going to be able to do. And so that's our sort of push there, but I think employers have a huge role to play.
Great. James, do you want to add anything on your employer relations?
I'm a broken record, but gratefully, don't pay your staff mileage reimbursement to drive, and that will have an immediate impact. In addition to that, I think it's a suite of variety of solutions. Many of the providers are already on here. But stuff like, you know, in Germany, they're looking at mobility credits for staff. So, you know, moving away from a car allowance, give someone a monthly mobility allowance, which is nicer than a new BMW on your drive, because you can access any sustainable form of transport as well. And providing, again, broken record, but like in France, where we've got the mobility budget there, where you can write it off offset against tax. It's a similar sort of thing. If you gave someone £400 and 50% of it was taken before income, that's a fairly good idea. And then you don't pay them for mileage, you'd see instant change. And I think big employers should sign up to that.
Can I just push you on the grey fleet issue? I know you did work with York when they consolidated their offices into one. They took away the grey fleet allowance, but their car club's based right by the office, but many of their workers work in quite a dispersed manner, and so actually it may have been better to have a more distributed fleet. I'm wondering if you're seeing a kind of a rethink, rather than making everyone have to come in order to go out again, whether there's other models that are out there.
Well, I think that's where we're looking, and York's a good example, where we're looking at commute style models that we could do in partnership, perhaps like lift share and others, where we would provide a shared asset at a different location they were driving to work. When that arrives, all the staff that need to do those variety of trips would then use that vehicle by multiple staff. So you've got the efficiency of multiple users going in, and then you've got the efficiency of staff when it's parked and then drive it to do those trips. So yes, we are looking at evolving that model. But typically on average, we cut CO2 by about 33% across all our customers when we come in. And from a cost perspective, it's around a third as well, reduction in cost. So you get the economic and environmental benefit. But you're right, that business, as I said, we derive revenue from utilization. So we want as many users as possible accessing our vehicle for any type of trip. And if we can get them to work in the morning with multiple people in it, that's fantastic.
Great. Ali?
So, I mean, there are two sides to this, really. There's, with my kind of lift sharing hat on, pre-COVID, in that 12 months pre-COVID, there were clients launching lift share schemes within 6 months, having 50% of their staff signed up to share, with some minor incentives such as reserved parking spaces if you share 2 or 3 days a week. So Arup got 51% of their staff sharing. They went from having a car park that was completely jammed to having spare spaces every day. Sandy from Arup, I think, spoke at the Como event a couple of years ago, totally happy. We're only sad that they're now moving to Birmingham, so they won't need lift sharing anymore. But they did an amazing job in a very short space of time. So it is totally doable to achieve massive behaviour change. COVID has shown us on a vast scale the role of policies and employers to impact on how their commuters get to work. We have an office. I'm sat in it now. I'm the only person here. We normally have 30 people sat upstairs. as an employer, we need to tell our team, you do not need to come to the office unless there's a very important client meeting or some innovation day. Stay at home, don't emit carbon, work. They're happier, they're healthier, their family lives are better, they're much better. So let's work on all the lessons we've learned from pre-COVID. Go back 2 years ago, none of us would have ever thought that we could have half the population working from home. It's shown us that we can. And it's also shown that the roles employers can make in supporting their staff to lead happy, healthy lifestyles by helping them with their commutes and also with business travel. We're doing this remotely. I love the fact that I'm not going to London every week just to go to an event. I can spend far more time working and talking to people remotely. I love seeing people, but this is making my life so much more efficient.
Can I just ask, does COVID pose some greater challenges for sharing though? Because people's weeks will look quite different over time. The mix of being in and out when you're in and out, does that make matching a more difficult prospect, or do you see that actually you've already managed to adapt to some of that?
I mean, what we're seeing from our members is they now have more flexibility. Employers are typically giving them more flexibility, which you may see as being bad. But actually, if you can say, I want to come in at 9 o'clock because that's when my lift share buddy comes in, they can share more. COVID has been more negative because the government have been saying don't share or don't use public transport. Now that's being reversed. And what we're seeing is individuals are sharing in far greater numbers. I mean, the numbers are going up rapidly from the members of the public. Employers are still wary about promoting sharing, because they're still concerned about the risks or being seen to encourage it, although that is now changing. And the whole Commute Back Better campaign is really driving momentum to generally employers are now wanting to get their staff sharing kind of from September onwards.
Great, thanks. And Joel, do you have anything to add on employers?
I think in terms of the types of solutions, I think Ali and others have already covered that. It's about Commute Back Better. It's about not making it necessary to drive to work anymore. A little bit of empathy with the people tasked with doing it within the companies coming out of COVID, especially. They haven't got time or resource for anything that isn't going to make them money. That's the sad state of affairs, is you can't expect companies to do things unless they don't, in an economy that runs on making money. So it's got to be carrot and stick. Yes, we can make these fantastic schemes available, but we've got to be prepared for the fact we've got to make it very financially favourable to expect them to do it as fast as they need to do it. It's just the unfortunate truth of commerce now, is it'll just get shoved to the back of the queue every time until it becomes the most expensive thing not to do.
Yeah, it seems pretty critical, the point that James majored on in terms of making sure that our tax system thinks about shared use, shared ownership, shared access, rather than being solely built around the individual ownership model. And I think there's work to be done to make sure that carries through into the Treasury's net zero review. So I don't think the job done on that one at all yet. The next question from Mark Hand, which is to Jess, but I guess again this will be of wider interest. How do you approach the task of understanding what the potential demand is for the commute in the areas that you operate?
I mean, for us, I mean, there's a huge amount of data available that can kind of tell you exactly where people live and exactly where people work. I think the UK census, the new census is about to come out, which kind of helps to populate that. We have recently acquired a company called Remix, small plug there, who have incredible analytical capabilities looking at how fixed routes should be rearranged to kind of accommodate the most number of people. We now have access to that, which is a pretty unique access stream, which allows us to do quite a lot of modeling before we ever suggest how many vehicles we'll need at peak or off peak. And most of our services now have pretty solid utilization during the peak hours. I think the thing that we try to manage better is the off peak hours. I think getting to utilization of 6, 8, 10 during peak is less of our concern. I think it's what do you do in the off peak and how do you kind of manage that flow? So that's us. I think we do quite a lot of data crunching. Also, a lot of councils, it's not great, but usually if we're taking over a legacy service, they have quite a bit of bus data. I would say bus companies are probably less transparent than they could be. And so it's not always perfect, but they have a decently sense of how many trips are being taken, particularly for all-in-one passengers, which are typically students and ENCTS passengers in the off-peaks, because they usually have to reimburse for them, in the peaks because they have to reimburse for them. And so we usually start there. I'd be interested, I guess you kind of come from the Mobilityways lift share world. I'd be interested in Ali. I know you guys do quite a lot of analysis on this to see where you guys get your data, but that's typically how we do our analysis up front.
Great. Anyone else want to come in on understanding commute demand patterns?
Yeah, I mean, the thought that went straight through my head when you were talking was the shift in consumers towards wanting personalization of services, which is when DRT comes right in. So you think how we use Amazon or anything. These big companies know a lot about us and provide amazing services designed straight just for us as a unique individual. Transport historically has taken bulk amounts of data that's non-personalized and tried to kind of put services out there that don't target me as an individual. I think this sector needs to wake up and start asking individuals what they want, where they need to go, and how they need to get there, or how they want to get there, and then provide sustainable services to serve them. You take the Uber model. Uber don't go into a city until they've got sufficient demand to go into there, and then once they're there, they target individuals. Every transport operator needs to be doing something similar other than trains because they're on pretty set tracks. But whether you're a bus or car sharing or car clubs, you've got to go where the demand is and then target individuals just in the same way that big American corporates would do.
Great, thanks. Okay, we'll move on to a couple of questions from Gary on, well, essentially the size of batteries and how big vehicles are going to get and some of the side effects. I mean, obviously there's the congestion and safety impacts, but also sort of microplastics and particulates still from tyres and brake wear. So does the sharing agenda allow us to address this? Does it help at all with the let's make everything bigger? I was interested by the question which had you know, what range do individuals need for their EV first thing this morning? You know, is it 450 miles? Is it an infinite amount of mileage? I think somebody ticked that maybe by mistake. But does sharing help us engage with, you know, right sizing? I don't know, James, maybe right sizing. Your company's responsible for a massive range of different types of vehicles, and yet we all tend to own, obviously, if we've got a car, one vehicle of one particular type, or perhaps two.
Yeah, well, going back to the earlier point, you typically buy the car for when you put a dog, 2 children, and you drive to Cornwall for 2 weeks a year, and then you use that car to drive into the city or wherever you might go on those smaller trips with one person occupying the vehicle. So that's very much where we see ourselves. We got the right vehicle for the right trip. So yeah, so that's the advantage of the diversity of the fleet.
Okay, anyone else on EV right sizing and sharing?
I think there's another psychological element to this. We've got to go back to what the car has represented for the last 100 years. It's all been about freedom and the one thing that you used to go to the shops, but if you wanted to, you could drive to Scotland on a whim. And the unfortunate cultural shift we've got to get is for people to let go of that and realize actually you have a way of getting around day to day, and then there are other ways to go further, because the vast majority of people cannot justify having, it's like the guy that buys a Range Rover for twice a year if he needs to go off road to a picnic. You need to shift that cultural obsession with one car to do it all and get to, you know what, this is my day-to-day car. You could have an 8-year-old Leaf that would do for the entire year, all but perhaps a couple of weekends. So we've got that really big challenge of making people realize, you know what, transport isn't what it used to be. We had that time, it's gone. Now you've got to think more about it. And that's a toughie.
I think just to, if I make an additional point on electrification, so I didn't cover that at all. It was welcome to see the government finally make public funding available to pay for EV charging infrastructure for car club, because it was absurd that they would procure our services and then tell us to get electric vehicles when they didn't have charging stations. So charging points. So that's a great shift. But we have a unique challenge as a business with electrification, because if it's easy to put, it's not easy, but it's easier to put one on your drive than it is to electrify a branch network of 500 locations effectively. And then our users do quite diverse trips. So we will benefit enormously from a huge rollout of EV charging points across the UK, but also need to, as a sector, this isn't just enterprise, needs to work with government to, we have large locations that are ideally located perhaps to open some of that charging infrastructure to the public as well. We need to mutualize it and work that way. So all of that needs to be figured out. And also they need to be rapid, because we currently fuel up our cars in about 2 minutes and then get them back out and rent, because we derive revenue from utilization. So 4 or 5 hours is too long. So there's some of the challenges we'll be facing in that space. But we are pleased about the car club funding now available for the industry.
One other small point I wanted to make on right sizing was that I think there is a role for government to play here. So if you think about buses at the moment in the UK, buses are defined, in order to be like to run a bus operation, you need to have more than 9 seats. You go to a lot of local rural communities, even in peak hour, they're probably only going to get 5 or 6 people in the vehicle. Why create a 15-person vehicle unnecessarily? So I think there's a little bit that can be done there. I think one thing that DRT does do nicely is that you can use slightly smaller vehicles because you're not restricted to fixed route roads that have bus stops and they're the only streets that you can go down. And so I think there has been some nice right sizing. I think the government could do more here.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Jess. We've got one regulatory regime for the bus network, which covers a huge diversity of circumstances, and it seems to me utterly heavy-handed for quite a large proportion of them. Not maybe the most intensively used areas, but that's definitely something that that could still be addressed.
Greg, one word that we haven't heard mentioned all day is scooter. So I've personally, when I did a straw poll in the office a year ago saying how many of the team would like to travel in by e-scooter in the morning, every hand went up. 2 years later, we're still at the point where I saw someone being arrested yesterday for driving their scooter in Norwich, even though they were quite happily going on the road. I am not aware of all the data behind it, but to me, it seems slightly crazy that we're encouraging people to drive 5-seater cars around, but we're dissuading them from going in on scooters. And when you look at the bus use during COVID, not the bus use, the cycle use during COVID, how it shot up when cars weren't on the roads and how it's gone right back to where it was before because cars are back on the roads. Scooters are, when they're alongside cars, are dangerous. When they're on pavements with pedestrians, are dangerous. But we've got so much real estate in roads that could so better be used by scooters and cyclists. I just think that there needs to be a fundamental policy to encourage micromobility over cars.
Yeah, Joel, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just want to second that. One of the most, don't get me wrong, it sounds like I'm really having a go at the report. There's good things in it, but one of the most annoying bits was about the cycling and how all this going on about have a bike, get on the train with it. Oh, and sometimes you can book. And for someone who's done that a lot, for 12 years, I get on the bike, I go to the train, and sometimes I can't get on, and there's all the room for 6 and all the rest of it. Sorry, that doesn't work. It's logistically impossible. Scooters, skateboards, things like this, it's so important that they deregulate that and let you own your own, because it's just, I don't know if it's because they can make money out of the licensing for those schemes or what, but just let us do that, because yes, there is a risk that someone might hurt your ankles. I'm really sorry about that. But while we've been talking, 3 more people have died from traffic fumes. So we need a bit of balance in the argument here. From my own personal point of view, we run on an assumed radius of half a mile around a host for their neighbours. That's how far they're prepared to walk home after they plug their car in. That could be 2 miles if you're allowed to just put an electric scooter in your boot. And those things, not necessarily just scooters, but anything that will move you easily over 1 or 2 miles is going to make a huge difference. Why on earth are we legislating them out? It's absolutely nuts. Sorry, another soapbox.
Yeah, no, but I thought it was interesting. There was a wider reference to electric micromobility that felt like it went beyond scooters and e-bikes as well, potentially a kind of very light, what would be not quite a car market, not sort of motorcycle type market, I guess a Renault Twizy type thing. There was mention of it. I just think we can't really dabble in this sort of stuff though. If we're gonna try it, we have to try it at scale somewhere.
The rest of the world does it. Why are we not doing it? If you can carry it under your arm on a train, bingo. It's very frustrating that we don't.
Great. So I'll encourage more questions still in the chat. We've got some which are beginning to wander off the topic slightly of sharing, but they're interesting nonetheless. One for you, I think, Joel, first off, from Sarah Wixie on there's so much emphasis on the challenges of home charging, yet ICE users don't have fuel stations on their drives. We need to do better to understand these anxieties. Do we understand what the motorist or the person who wants access to an electric car really wants?
I think that's hit on probably the most important nail of all. We have, over the last 10 or 12 years as an industry, evolved this rather bubble-based, supplier-based view on how to do this. And actually it's time now, and I know it's not just me thinking this, to start asking the motorists and realize we live in a bubble. We're obsessed with this. We're educated. We look into how to do this. Johnny Motorist doesn't. and he's scared and he's change resistant, and we're asking him to make a big change. We need to understand what is that model, what are the phases they go through. I work on one which we're looking to do some research on this. I'm hoping for a white paper in the next few months. At the moment, it looks like it's a 3-stage process of the EV thing. There's your deferrer, someone who is looking for anything on the internet as an excuse not to look into EVs or to look into alternative e-mobility, anything sustainable. Then eventually you get them through that because, I don't know, their kids nag them into it or whatever it is. And then they get to inquirer. And that's when they hit the real problems like the one Co-Charge is there to solve and all the others. And then you get to the EV owner and then they won't shut up about their car. I think we really don't understand. It's one of the reasons I think that the report obsesses with public chargers instead of base charging is they ask the public why they don't buy EVs. And the public, of course, respond from a very uninformed point of view. They go, oh, well, I need someone to charge it. And they assume it's like running a fuel car. They assume I need electric petrol pumps. And instead of just going, and answering that and saying, oh, we need more public infrastructure and we need cheaper cars, they should push back and say, actually, let's give you better information as to what it's like running an electric car. And if you once you understand that, and I do this for a living, once you get someone to realize it's more like a mobile phone, suddenly everything makes sense and they'll start asking the right questions. So at the moment, they're getting 42 and looking blankly at us. Sorry, Douglas Adams reference, I hope that's all right. I think it's exactly down to that. Let's understand the mental journey of the public and please start helping them to understand better because they have had 15 years of misinformation. I even heard some of it quoted on this event earlier by a very well-known luminary, and he quoted some well-known misinformation from the fossil fuel industry. If it can get that far through, poor Joe Bloggs has no chance. So I think it's really important. Let's get inside their heads and start communicating better, informing people better so that they can ask the right questions.
Yeah, I think it's really important that whatever our early decisions are, we're constantly looking to see whether we're making the right assumptions about those behaviours so that we're not putting billions of pounds into the wrong sort of infrastructure that we're subsequently saddled with later on.
Ironically, can I just make a really important point on that? The effect of focusing more on base charging is that you need more public infrastructure. One creates the users of the other. This is why it's a bit of a strange thing. It's kind of being pushed to one side. Without base charging, there's no one to use your public infrastructure. So that's the big shift that's got to come around.
I think also just another point to add to that, that there's over 8,300 petrol stations in the United Kingdom, which are in close proximity, so it is easier, unless you've got the base charging, I fully acknowledge that, to fuel your vehicles currently as an ICE vehicle than it is as an EV due to the sheer number. And then, as Joel said, that needs to grow. And yeah, even for our business, we would benefit from an increase in base charging points because when people rent our vehicles or use them for work and need to take them home, wherever it might be, and it builds the surrounding infrastructure that will help us.
Yeah, I think so. We're talking to a lot of councils, and the first light bulb that we try to get to go on is, you know, if I'm talking to someone in Bristol and they're saying we've got this plan to put all these public rapid chargers, you have to say, you do realise that's not for Bristolians, right? That's for people from Southampton and Exeter. But we need you to put them in for those people. And it's that realisation of, no, what you're putting in there as public charging is for visitors. What the people in your city need is base charging. And there's that sort of light bulb moment. I go, oh, okay. And the good news is half of them can probably have a home charger. So result, that's really good. That's just communications. That's cheap. And for the other half, there's this combination of things. Okay, Co-Charge is one of them. So the bad news is they're getting it all wrong. The good news is they can solve it quite easily.
Great. Now we're coming up to 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give me one thing that they would like to see happen next, whether it's Treasury or DFT or local authorities. What would you like to see happen next? And just while I'm giving you 30 seconds to pick that up, a few more comments in the chat. John Carr picked up on the trade-offs between working from home, travelling in, all the emissions from home. I think on balance, the CCC's report suggested there was a much greater saving from travel emission reductions than there was an increase in residential emissions, but that's something that we need to continually keep an eye on, what the right balance is there. And Steve Gooding's put in recently suggested that people ought to reevaluate whether they need an SUV. Quite brave, putting his head above the parapet there, and he got a fairly sharp reaction by the looks of it. So I think this whole engaging with car culture is still something that you know, sits underneath all of this. While we're talking about sharing, people are also buying individualized massive SUVs. So, you know, there could be a duality going on. People in the room here might well be motivated by the shared model, but we have certainly not busted the individualized ownership of bigger and bigger vehicles as things stand at the moment. And I don't see the tax system helping us particularly there. Okay, so let's go round our 4 speakers. So I'll start with James, then go to Jess, then Joel, then Ali.
Won't surprise anyone. Tax, and we need to bring in tax reform that supports the growth of the shared mobility sector, whether that's mobility budgets, a reference that we have in France, but a more expanded version, or whether that's eliminating prohibitive tax like benefit in kind on shared mobility services. Shared mobility providers should receive, and then users of shared mobility services should be incentivized through tax to use those programs.
Great, thanks, James. Jess.
To veer slightly off tax, I'm going to talk a little bit about funding. So for me, I think the thing I thought was the most ironic was kind of the discussion that, like, you know, we think electric is super important. We're going to put 3 billion to electrification of buses largely, and a little bit also towards bus priority lanes. But we've acknowledged that sharing actually could do more to make the bus network more effective and efficient. And we're going to put 20 million as a trial to rural mobility pilots. I think realistically, there needs to be a better ROI assessment of what initiatives result in what emissions reductions and comparable funding towards that, rather than just say, okay, electrification of everything feels like the right move and feels easy. Let's just pile as much money as we can into that. So that's sort of my ask, a better ROI assessment of funding to actual emissions reductions.
Great, thanks, Jess. And Joel.
I'd say stop solutionizing and take a step back and take some time and put some effort into understanding the real problem and rebalance the efforts and the resources on the things that actually make the difference and help us to stop burning stuff.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joel. Ali.
So I would focus on employers, public and private, and I would mandate them to report on their transport emissions. And I think given that kind of context, every employer would start looking at the best ways to reduce it. They won't just look at a mode, they'll look at doing it place-based for them. If they can get more people walking or cycling, they will. If they can get people doing DRT, they will. If they can get people car sharing, they will. If they can sort out charging, they will. Employers are quite savvy because they need to keep their workforce happy. So I would mandate employers to do it in the same way that they have to do on their energy emissions, which clearly has shown a massive reduction in CO2 as a result.
Great, thanks, Ali. So a great session. We'll draw it to a close there. Just a couple of observations. I mean, I think it's great you've all identified the things which need to happen next. So it's one thing writing that we need more sharing in a plan. What we need to see now is the actions which start to make that sharing more and more likely with every decision that's taken. So I think that's with all aspects of the TDP. It's a plan, and we've got to make that plan reality. So there's still plenty of work to do on the way. I think the other thing that stood out for me was Joel's comment on solutionism, which might seem strange. I'm amongst companies that I think are fantastic, and I really like the solutions you're developing. But in general, the TDP was very supply side dominated. It didn't have much about people. And actually, we need to understand people and what they're doing, their behaviours and their choices. I think that's partly why there's the risk of the kind of SUV market thing heading off in one direction. We've got to bring people into this, and I thought that was something that was really short in the plan, and that's obviously particularly touches on the heart of the kind of businesses which you're all developing. So I think there's a lot more to be done to make this real to society, and that's going to require a lot of work with local authorities as well. Not all of that falls on your shoulders, but yeah, just some observations at the end of the session. So we've got we'll close the session now. We've got 5 minutes before the next plenary started. I was instructed to give you the chance to go and probably put ice on your heads if it's anywhere near as hot in your room as it is in mine. So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to our panel of speakers.